The following program on KROC is sponsored and paid for by Meshbesher Spence.
Andrew Davick is in from Meshbesher Spence. Good to see you, Andrew.
Good morning.
Our topic was, I don't know what it was going to be.
We're going to talk about
Summer
boating.
injuries is what we were going to talk.
No, we're going to different topic altogether. No,
Yeah.
we were talking about, when Andrew got into the studio, about an interview that I did with an infectious disease doctor from Mayo, Dr. Tosh. Mm-hmm. And he was saying that after 25 years of staying steady, sexually transmitted diseases in the 18 to 25-year-old range, which had been previously falling, are beginning to dramatically spike, and they can attribute it to apps that people use, their smartphone apps, to hook up.
Find friends.
It's easier
so
to
speak.
find someone
Really?
with whom to share your sexually transmitted disease.
Not a good deal.
Not a good deal. And you said that would make a great topic, and I thought, there's a legal, of course there's a legal part to that.
There's always a legal part to anything.
Certainly.
Lawyers always get involved in some fashion. No, you've got two potential issues, obviously, that arise from contact where you have transmission of a disease of a sexual nature. First, you have the potential criminal implications that can arise from that. You may have seen in the news over the last, I think it's been the last year, there have been a few cases charged out around the country involving individuals who were aware that they had, I believe in both instances, I believe they were HIV positive, and they were engaged in unprotected sex and did not disclose the fact that they had HIV. And some of the partners ultimately contracted the condition, and they were able to link it to the individual who had HIV based upon, obviously, they almost essentially create like a tree of partners to figure out where the source of it is, and they ultimately charge that individual criminally. I believe in those instances, I believe they were charged with assault.
Really?
And that was because the individual had knowledge and ultimately engaged in unprotected sex, which created an unreasonable risk of harm to that individual.
Part of the problem, Dr. Tosh was saying, is that, when I was a kid, my age range is terrified of HIV because we were teenagers when it was discovered. And today's 18 to 25-year-olds don't see it as a problem because they're like, oh, isn't there some drugs you can take and you're fine? It's not a big deal.
Absolutely.
And so that's part of the reason why probably if they're having unprotected sex and transmitting an STD, maybe it's because they think, well, it's not that big a deal, right?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I remember growing up in Rock Hudson.
Right.
Was sort of
we were terrified of it.
Of the AIDS epidemic, and everyone had concern. And
Magic
Johnson. And you're right. I mean, now I think there's this belief or this assumption that you can take a drug cocktail and ultimately you're going to be relatively symptom-free and lead a normal life, and I don't think that obviously is the case. I mean, I'm sure.
But that's not the only STD that is passed along either. I mean, but that's probably the most serious, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, herpes and genital warts and all
that's
those
forever.
other conditions, are significant. And so you not only have the criminal implications or the criminal ramifications if you have knowledge. I mean, one of the important components is that you have knowledge that you have the condition and that you did not disclose it to your partner and engage in unprotected sex. But then there's also the civil component where an individual is infected with the condition, and as a result of that non-disclosed unprotected sex, they could potentially sue that individual for monetary damages as a result of the medical care and treatments and the changes that happens, and there's a likelihood insurance isn't going to cover that.
Wow.
To me, though, it's almost like you're walking a tightrope without a net, and you fall off the tightrope and you blame the rope.
Wow, Rich.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're doing something that's
right.
That if it's unprotected, especially, and
exactly.
There's that defense.
Yeah, exactly.
I always talk about not wanting Rich as a juror. I think this is another example of that. I'm not sure.
Well, and then this explains why, I mean, someone who is willing or likely to hook up for random encounters, it's easier to find that type of a person if you're that type of a person using an app like Tinder.
Yeah, and Rich does make a good point. I mean, the law, when you're dealing with negligence claims or civil liability claims, there is this concept of comparative fault. So the individual who chooses to engage in conduct which unreasonably exposes them to risk, if they choose to have unprotected sex and an individual develops an STD, there is a potential comparative fault. The jury may find that they bear some responsibility for what has occurred. It doesn't fall solely on the individual who transmitted it.
Wouldn't they have to prove? I asked them if they had HIV. They said no.
Well, maybe. Other than, I think there's just this. If you're smart, you're protecting yourself. Regardless. I mean, especially if it's an encounter that you're engaged. You get through Tinder. You would hope that the individual is not just trusting somebody that they just saw their picture on the the World Wide Web and decided to engage in a hookup. But again, it doesn't change the fact that there's no way Rich will ever sit on one of my juries.
You said the other point had to do with the apps, like using the smartphone, and where is there any responsibility that Tinder has to anything at all? They just say we put our app out there and people use it, and we don't have any responsibility.
You sound like a trial lawyer who's trying to create a class action now.
So do you want me on your jury?
So she's on my jury, Rich. You're not. I apologize, but no, that's an interesting question. You see these types of lawsuits that arise. You've seen it in the fast food industry. You've seen it with the tobacco industry in terms of smoking, and that's an interesting question as to whether or not something like that will ultimately develop. That the rise of these applications on these iPhones has created an environment which has led to these additional costs, and typically those cases succeed when the human cost or the governmental cost starts to rise. So you were talking about Dr. Tosh talking about this increase of STDs, and they can link it, at least in some respects, to the advent of these apps. That potentially has some legs. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to be pursuing that, but it's an interesting legal question.
To liken it to a tobacco case.
And,
absolutely.
One other thing. You mentioned that it was, 18 to 25-year-olds?
18 to 25-year-olds, and
the second largest group where they have the rise
the baby boomers. We're all looking at you, Rich Peterson.
Don't look at me.
Moving into the senior housing type of situations, and all of a sudden everybody...
All of these widows.
Interesting.
Right. If somebody would like to get a hold of an attorney, find out if maybe Andrew would like them on his jury or not, or just you need an attorney, you get a question, whatever, you need to get a hold of Andrew. How do you do that?
Feel free to stop by our office on 2nd Street. Give us a call at 280-8090 or go to the website, www.meshbesher.com.
Andrew, have a great week.
You too.